Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Smith, Professor Emeritus of Religion at Ripon College, and I'm also the co-director of the Center for Politics and the People at Ripon College, along with my colleague, Professor Henrik Schatzinger of the Politics and Government Department. Our conversation tonight is also co-sponsored by the Department of Psychology at Ripon College. It is my great honor this afternoon to welcome to a conversation Rich Harwood, the president and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation in Bethesda, Maryland. For over 3 decades, he has devoted his career to revitalizing some of our hardest hit communities, assisting them to enhance dialogue and cooperation among citizens at the local level. The Harwood Institute, which he founded in 1988, has been working since then to promote community-based solutions to public problems and to strengthen our civic culture. Its Turning Outward program has established partnerships with local groups in all 50 US states, and its philosophy and strategies are being used in 40 countries around the world. The Institute's approach of strengthening local community groups is being used in Flint and Detroit, Michigan, the Mississippi Delta, Youngstown, Ohio, and Newton, Connecticut, after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Rich, or his work, or I should say, and his work, have been featured in several national media programs, including the special report by Brit Hume on Fox, CNN's Inside Politics, the NewsHour on PBS, and most recently, Meet the Press Daily on MSNBC. This afternoon, Rich Harwood will discuss with us the findings of a recent report he authored entitled Civic Virus: Why Polarization is a Misdiagnosis. The report summarizes in-depth interviews with focus groups in 15 different counties across the United States last year. He finds that political polarization is a symptom, not a cause of divisions among Americans. There are deeper personal challenges citizens face in their personal lives, causing anxiety and fear about their loss of control and a sense of what is really going on in the country due to rampant misinformation. This leads, he concludes, to a fight or flight tendency in their civic lives. Some political and media leaders are exploiting this anxiety and tendency for their own narrow purposes. Thus, they are the ones who are producing ideological polarization among citizens. Rich and I will engage in conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes about the report and its recommendations for promoting a healthier civic culture. We'll then turn to questions submitted ahead of time by those of you who registered for the webinar, and finally to questions listed in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So I would remind the virtual attendees that as we're having our conversation, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen or in the chat room. So let's begin our conversation, Rich. In your recent report, Civic Virus, you discovered today people are experiencing a loss of a sense of reality and control based on rampant information of what's really happening in the country. And you find them disoriented and feeling helpless. Can you explain with what this means and how citizens today feel differently from the report you issued 30 years ago on citizens and politics?
Sure. First, Brian, let me say thank you for having me, and let me say thank you to Ripon College for being the host of this event. As we've talked, I wish I was in Wisconsin with you tonight and not doing this via Zoom, but soon enough I will be in Wisconsin and on your campus.
Wait till the weather gets a little better out here, Rich. It's
that
cold
sounds
today.
good. That sounds good. You know, first you were asking, so what does it feel like? And let me give you sort of a picture of what it feels like. What it feels like, I think, for a lot of people is that, you know, they're kind of stuck in a house of mirrors. And they know that there is a doorway out, but they can't find it. And as all of us have experienced in our own personal lives, there is nothing worse in the world than feeling trapped, than feeling disoriented, then feeling as though there's no way out of the challenges and the problems that we're facing in our lives, or in this case, not only in our personal lives, but in the life of our communities and the life of our nation. So that's a picture, I think, that's worth keeping in mind. Now, how does this differ from 1990? It's vastly different from 1990. You know, when we went out and talked to folks in 1990, the conventional wisdom, if you remember, was that Americans were apathetic about politics and public life. And what we found, in fact, was they weren't apathetic at all. They felt pushed out by politicians, by the news media, by special interests. And they felt pushed out because at that time they believed that politicians weren't listening to them, that the news media weren't reflecting their concerns and their stories, and that special interests were fighting for their own good. Go all the way up now 30 some odd years to today. What did we find? Well, the conventional wisdom is that people are, as you said, polarized. And what we found is they don't feel polarized. They feel, as you said, disoriented. They feel as though the reality is being distorted. They're in this fight or flight mode. And what is different, fundamentally different about 1990 to today is in 1990, it's as if the problem was out there affecting something beyond me, but that didn't necessarily affect me in my daily life. Today, what people have said is that this virus that we've identified has spread throughout the country, has infiltrated our homes, has infiltrated our lives, and it's now touching us. It is not simply out there. It is within us and between us and among us. It has infected us. And we can't find any kind of, like we do with COVID, you know, a shot that we can take to inoculate us from a virus. There is no shot that we can take to inoculate us from a civic virus that we're now facing.
Well, can you give us some examples of what citizens said in these focus groups? How did they express this frustration and anxiety? Can you give us kind of a flavor of some of
Sure.
the things that you have? I think there were some great quotes in that report. If you could share some of them with us.
Yeah, sure. Let me just give you 3 or 4 of them that sort of remind me of the flavor and really, more importantly, the potency of what people said. You know, there was someone, Brian in Flint, that I remember, who said at one point, I wouldn't say we're polarized, I would say that we are segregated. And that's a theme that we heard throughout this report. There was someone in Utah County, Utah, around Provo, is where Utah County, who said, we've lost our way. We have failed to remember how to compromise and look for workable solutions. There was someone who said, this has really stuck with me, we may look different, we may come from different places, but we're all still human. We're all still human. And as you know, Brian, because you've read the report, one of the things that sort of is a through line in everything that people said is that we've lost a sense of who we are. We've lost a sense of how we are connected to one another. We've lost more than just a sense, we've lost the ability and the ways in which we can become connected to one another. And which reminds me of another quote, if I can just add one more, from someone from Eugene, Oregon, Lane County, who said something to the effect of, we are untethered from one another. And then this person said, in fact, we are untethered from ourselves, which is sort of the sense of loss of reality and not being able to figure out what's up and what's down, what's true and what's not true, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense anymore, who you can believe and who you can't believe. This sense of being untethered. And as I said before in the House of Mirrors analogy, there's nothing worse than feeling disoriented and feeling trapped. And that's a sense of feeling untethered in some ways.
And I think what you point out in the report is that there are people in this country, some in politics, some in the media, who are really capitalizing and manipulating that vulnerability in order to create the illusion that people are helplessly ideologically divided.
Yeah, we're playing, you know, when I was younger, Brian, before I started the Harwood Institute, I worked on 20 political campaigns by the time I was 23 years old. The last one, I was an aide to a presidential candidate. And I left politics. I thought I would run for office myself. And I left politics because I felt at that time, this is in the mid 80s, that too many political campaigns were all about striking fear into people's heart and doing anything to win. And my God, when you think about the difference between the mid 80s to today, things have only gotten worse in our politics and public life. And there are so many examples of how politicians and our leaders, how the news media are, according to people in this report, deliberately, intentionally manufacturing polarization, division, so that we can appear divided. And not only that, Brian, it's not only that we can appear divided, it's that when you create that much fear in people, in human beings, ultimately you feel that unless you pick up sides, this is where the fight or flight comes in, unless you pick up sides, you're going to get run over. You're going to lose what you have. Someone's going to take something away from you, or you flee, right? You fully retreat. And that's what's happening in our society today. And the last thing I'll say about this is, who the hell gave these individuals the right to do this? Who gave our political leaders the mandate to polarize and divide us and strike fear in us in the ways in which they do? Who gave people the right to get on the air every night? That people on the right and the left do. It's just not one or the other, it's both sides. And drum up fear, drum up people's worst feelings about one another, drum up our biases and prejudices that may be there, but somehow we know aren't true, but when they're drummed up, we act on them and speak about them. Who gave them the right to do that?
And you point out so well in the report that you discovered underneath all of this, people do feel they have some common bonds with other people, particularly in their local communities. And that during COVID, as you pointed out, there are many wonderful community coming together to help people in need. So that the sad thing is that underneath there is this wellspring of goodness and hope that you found in these groups. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, let me give you a really concrete example, but for sure there are real differences in our society, right? There are legitimate, real differences that people have. But here's an example that actually happened after the report, but relates to everything in the report. So to build on what you just said, we're doing work in Reading, Pennsylvania. 10 years ago, it was named the poorest community in America. And we're working on education issues there. And we're working on these issues at the time when our politicians and the news media and special interests are stoking issues like critical race theory, banning books, right? School board upheavals, right? Striking fear into people and using it as a way to gain control. At the very time that that was happening, folks in Reading, Pennsylvania came together over a year of discussion and engagement, leaders and citizens, residents, and came up with an education reform agenda, a shared education agenda for their young people that they are coming together now, Brian, and starting to take action on. At the very same time that we've been divided by critical race theory, banning books, masks in schools, school board upheavals, folks in Reading, Pennsylvania came together and created the shared agenda. Now, here's the thing. Not only did we do this in Reading, Pennsylvania, it happened in Lexington, Kentucky. It happened in Clarksville, Tennessee, the same exact thing. And so it demonstrates, to your point, that when we are intentional and under the right conditions, people can overcome and transcend these false differences, come up with shared agendas, not agree on everything, but agree on enough that we can actually get together and get to work and actually demonstrate that we can get things done together.
So in a sense, when you're talking about the civic virus, there is a vaccine or an inoculation that's going on at the local level to counter that virus. Just to use that medical terminology, that you have discovered there is a solution here that people are finding themselves so that they can be inoculated against some of the spin doctors that are trying to manipulate them.
Yeah, so here's the thing, that's a great point. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me one way to talk about this is, as much as Dr. Fauci is a hero for many people in our society, we don't need a Dr. Fauci here. we each have the vaccine within us, and we can use it to we have the superpower within us to inoculate ourselves and our fellow citizens against this civic virus. What we have to decide in really basic terms, and I think this happens by looking in the mirror, is do we want to step forward?
Yeah.
Do we want to take the risk in this environment to step forward, to join, to reach out to someone who may be different, may, as that quote I read to you, may look different from us, may come from another side of town than us, may be one person worked on a farm, another person worked in the city or in a suburban area. Can we reach across those dividing lines, or what we perceive as dividing lines, and not agree on everything, but articulate what we are for and where we can get to work together and start to build together and demonstrate that we can restore our faith in ourselves and one another, that we can get things done.
Well, that's a wonderful segue into your final part of your report, where you offer 7 steps that you think can be taken by citizens to strengthen their civic culture and to really cooperate and talk to each other again. So you want to talk about some of these recommendations that you have in the report?
Yeah, let me just reel off a few of them really quickly, and then maybe we can get into more of them if folks want. One is, I think we need to engage ourselves in discussions about our shared aspirations. So many of our conversations today are framed about problems and who's to blame, which puts us kind of in a toxic cul-de-sac, right? We can't get out of it. Or, Brian, they're framed in terms of utopian visions that will never be attained. And honestly, people hear and they say, well, what's that got to do with my life? I'm trying to make ends meet in my life. You're talking about utopian visions. So an alternative to that is to frame our discussions around our shared aspirations. Those aspirations come from within us. And if you ask someone about their shared aspirations for their community, they're usually actionable, doable, and achievable. And when we do it together, we begin to understand and see that we share something in common, notwithstanding our differences, that the aspirations we hold for ourselves and our communities cannot be achieved by any one of us or any one leader or any one organization. We need each other, and they implicate us in taking action. So that's one thing. Let me give you another quick example if I can.
Sure.
I think we need more boundary spanning entities, organizations, groups in our communities. I've been doing this work now for so long, for over 30 years, and over that 30-year period, more and more groups, we've done millions of dollars of research on this, but you don't need our research to know this. More and more groups and organizations have become inward looking. They're concerned about their own strategies and programs. They're concerned about their own metrics. They're concerned about getting credit for deeds they didn't do. They're concerned about raising more money. But they've got their head down so much they can't even see the community they're supposed to be serving. And so we need organizations that are turned outward toward the community and that make it their business to bring people together across dividing lines, to work together, to get to know each other, to reduce the fears that we have about each other, and to get some stuff done together. And we can do that. We're doing that, where our work does that in communities all across the country.
In those suggestions, you say we need a new kind of leader at the local level.
Yeah.
You already touched upon that about outward-looking people, but you want to say a little bit more. Why aren't the leaders that we have now, for example, in our local government or voluntary organizations, why do you think we need something new that these leaders need to emphasize?
Well, let me just go back to Reading, Pennsylvania as an example. And this is a community that wants to act on this shared agenda. What they said is we need new leaders. They said our leaders are too concerned about their own organizations, that our political leaders are too concerned about simply getting elected, that too many of our faith leaders are concerned about simply putting people in seats and not about asking us to rise above those things. Too many leaders are concerned about fighting with one another. And so what's the converse of this? We need leaders who are turned outward. We need leaders who have a sense of working with others in productive ways, not destructive ways. We need leaders who build up their communities, not tear them down for their own gain. We need leaders who know and who value and know how to create a shared sense of purpose in their community so that we are part of something larger than ourselves. And look, here's the thing. Those leaders who are turned outward, this new breed of leader that I'm talking about, that I see every day in lots of communities, the ironic thing is they gain more supporters than the leaders who are turned inward. Their work is more relevant than the leaders who are turned inward. They tend to raise more money than the leaders who are turned inward. They have more partners than the leaders who are turned inward. So my God, if we could ground ourselves better and turn outward and get more serious and more intentional about what we need to achieve, we all win. We can all win. And that's the thing.
Well, you mentioned about linking to something larger. Let me push back here a little bit. The co-sponsor of this event tonight is the psychology department at Ripon College. And the American Psychological Association just recently issued its annual report on what are the major causes of stress in Americans' lives. And they identify national, not local issues, such as inflation, the economy, the war in the Ukraine, the long-term effects of COVID pandemic. So how can strategies at the local level deal with this incredible stress that comes from the national level? What's the linkage that you see there, Rich?
See at least two linkages. So one is, if you read our report and you put it next to the APA's report, what you would find is that people don't have a sense of agency. You would find that people don't feel a sense of control. You would find that people don't feel that others empathize with them. You would find that people don't feel validated and accepted in their lives, right? I think, I haven't read the APA report, but I would imagine these are common things. That can start at the local level. We have the control to make that happen within our daily lives. And the more sense of agency, the more sense of voice, the more sense we believe that we matter, the more sense that we reduce fear in our daily lives, the more the conditions that that national report talks about can be reduced, and the better we can begin to feel about ourselves. That's part A. That's necessary, but not sufficient. The sufficient part is, how does American public life change over time? Throughout, as you know better than I do, Brian, throughout American history, change has typically started at the local level. It has begun to bubble up, and then eventually national leaders courageous and brave national leaders grab hold of it, those who are willing to step forward. So it's a bottom-up and top-down strategy. And they begin to amplify it and carry it forward. That happened in the American Revolution. It happened in the abolition movement. It happened with women's suffrage, with seatbelt laws, right? With a whole slew of things. Well, we need to do it again. We need to do it again.
Well, as Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. And I think what you're saying is all civic virtue and culture begins locally, if it's going to have any lasting effect.
And yes, and if it's going to be, to your point about lasting effect, if it's going to be sustainable. You know, I just wrote a piece recently that talks about why is it that we have these moments of unity, like the war in Ukraine, COVID for a moment, right? After natural disasters, we have these moments of unity and then they dissipate. They dissipate and then we return to where we were. And it's because we haven't built durable enough civic virtue and civic culture that is rooted in our daily lives and grows out. Instead, it gets imposed on us. We get called to send in donations. It's a wonderful thing that we do that, but it's not sustainable over time.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. And before we turn to the questions, maybe we could put up on the screen some information so that if people want more information about the Institute or how to get in touch with the Institute or its reports, people can take a look at this, this slide that we have up on the screen here, the links for signing up for news and updates, or to get more information about your latest books, or to learn more about the approach that the Harwood Institute uses at the local level. And what we'll do is we'll put this in the chat room, and also to those who are attending, we will send out later the link to the recording of this conversation. And in that email, I will include these links for people so that later they don't have to write everything down right now. Later, they can view this when they get the follow-up email and click into any of these links that they want to. Does that sound acceptable?
Sounds terrific.
Okay, well, let's go to some of the questions. There were several questions which I sent you that people who registered could list ahead of time. So I'd like to begin with those and then encourage people now to be putting in the chat room or in the Q&A, those who are attending, your additional questions. So the first question comes from someone I think you know. He's in the state of Virginia, David Toscano, the former Democratic leader of the Virginia House of Delegates. And he wants to ask you, can you provide any concrete examples from the state houses around the nation where people are trying to create norms and practices encouraging civil discourse and collaborative decision-making?
Yeah, well, David is actually, Brian, in a much better position to answer this question than I am. So I wish he were sitting next to me so I could say, so David, what do you think? And, as David knows, there are new caucuses created, supported by the National Institute for Civic Dialogue or Civil Dialogue that have been created. There are millennial caucuses that are created of younger leaders in state houses. In Congress, there's the Problem Solvers Caucus. Years ago, including in Wisconsin, Brian, we created something called the New Patriotism Project Caucus, which was about political conduct that we worked with folks in the state legislature in Wisconsin. So there are things happening. Here's the thing, though. We recently did 2 reports about state legislators with state legislators. And as David knows, and as many of the folks who are joining us here know, state legislatures have become sort of mirrors of what's going on in Congress. In many cases, they've become as polarized and as divisive and as acrimonious. And to pick up a theme that you and I were talking about just a moment ago, while I believe these caucuses and other efforts need to be created within state legislatures, I think more state legislators need to get out of the legislature into their communities and not hold typical town hall meetings and listening sessions, because in too many of them, they're just talking and not listening. But I think they genuinely need to gauge their constituents in a way that they listen deeply. And going back to your point about the vaccine, the civic vaccine, the more deep knowledge legislators have from communities, the more authority from the community they have, and the more that can serve as an inoculation against special interests and other groups that are trying to push state legislators in one direction or another, because they can say, look, I've listened deeply, this is what I understand, and this is what I believe we need to do. I think that's a key ingredient, not the only one, but a key ingredient to moving forward.
Good, thank you. We have a resident here in our local area of Green Lake, Nancy Hayburgs, and she asked this question. In your focus groups, did you find that some people were more suspicious of or avoided people with a college degree if they only went through high school? Did you see that any divisions in these groups? Because you did say the groups pretty much crossed boundaries.
In every way possible.
So do you want to say something about that?
Sure. The answer is no, we did not find that. I think instead, what that question makes me think about is what we did find, but this transcended education levels, this transcended income levels, this transcended political affiliation, which is that there was a kind of universal feeling or belief that if you talk down to me, if you make me feel stupid, if you believe I don't know what I'm talking about, then I will be suspicious of you. If I believe that you're playing on my fears, I will be suspicious of you, even if I choose to end up agreeing with you because I'm in a fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
I still might be suspicious of you. Now, sure, there are people at both extremes who fervently and ideologically believe whatever they're hearing. But that's not most people. That's folks at the extremes. And so the answer to Nancy's question is actually no. And actually, this is to Nancy's question. I'm glad she asked it. It's one of the things that gives me hope, because the class warfare that some politicians stoke works, but it doesn't have to work. It doesn't have to work.
As a follow-up to that, I was very impressed with the end of the report where it gave some of the final reflections and some people who participated. And there was a new learning experience.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that? There was hope. And they were surprised to have found it so productive to talk to people who were different from themselves.
Yeah, and those of us who do this work a lot, we see this happen, but we included it in the report because honestly, it was so heartfelt by the folks who said these things. And Brian, all those comments in the section of the report that you're talking about came after we ended the conversation.
Yeah.
After we ended. And people would look around, this was all on Zoom because it was during the height of COVID, but people would look around even in rural areas where they didn't know each other. Or maybe they did know some people because the areas were so small. And they would look around and they'd say, who would have thought? Who would have thought? I didn't think this was possible. As you said, there were people in that part of the report who said, I learned so much. And I remember a couple of people in that section, Brian, who are older Americans who said, I'm older. These were people in their 70s, maybe in their 80s, who said, and I still learned something new today. And it was really, even just as I think about it, sitting here today, it was so heartwarming, and also in a more practical sense, demonstrated that under the right conditions, we Americans are still able to step forward, see and hear one another, disagree with one another, and still find things that we can agree on so that we can get moving together. And in a practical sense, I think that's a really critical message to be hearing today.
Very hopeful, Rich. We have a question from one of our alumni at Ripon College, Catherine Schultz, the class of 1989. She worked for years in the State Department on nuclear arms control. Now she's retired, but she asked a question about history. Catherine wants to know, haven't Americans always separated and segregated to varying degrees? How and why is what's happening today different from what's happened throughout our history?
Yes, first of all, Catherine's another person, like David, I wish you were here because she would have a lot to say to us about what's going on in the world and in our lives today. Yeah, look, I'm Jewish. My family came to the United States. They all went to the Lower East Side of New York. They ultimately went to Brooklyn. They all congregated together. That's true for the Irish. It's true for Italians. It's when I worked in Battle Creek, Michigan, not too long ago, it was true for the Burmese population who had moved to Battle Creek and found themselves there. It's natural. We all congregate. Here's what's different is that we are now separating and segregating to a much larger extent, and we are staying separated and segregated. We aren't coming together. We aren't seeking, in a sense, like my family did, to assimilate or become part of something larger than ourselves. We're joining teams, right? We're joining camps, political camps,
Tribes.
And we're tribes. We're building fortresses around ourselves, and we're protecting ourselves from one another. We don't have the desire to come together. We don't have a desire. I think we do have the desire, but we are so fearful and disoriented that we're hunkered down and worried about what's going to happen. So one other part about this, when my family came to America, to the United States, we didn't have the fragmentation in our public life that we do today. We didn't have the fragmentation we didn't have cable television. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have political consultants. We didn't have all these special interest groups. We didn't have all these organizations that work in Washington, D.C. that call themselves nonprofits, but operate like special interest groups. So all of those things have fundamentally changed the landscape. And when I got into this work in the mid 80s, a lot of these things didn't exist either, not to the extent that they do today. And so the extent to which things changed, the pace at which they changed is fundamentally different than what we've experienced in the past.
And your father, reading about your history, formed a synagogue, and that brought people together. You must be very proud of your family that was involved in civil rights for years and in the Jewish community. So it's really inspiring to read your personal history and how it opened you up, Rich, to community service.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, it's an example, not to talk about my parents, but to talk about the effects. There were examples of people reaching out across dividing lines. There were examples of people, you know, my father was the one who held the first ecumenical service in our community because most people had never met a Jew in upstate New York. And it was the first time for sure they heard Hebrew. But he didn't do it alone. He did it with other faith leaders.
Yeah.
Right? He did it with other community leaders. They came together, and that was true on a whole collection of issues in the community. That's what we need to not get back to. It's what we need to reimagine for the future and create a new moving forward.
One final question before we go to the Q&A of the attendees. A person named Meredith Machin picks up on your medical term, which we talked about before. And she says, is Civic Virus capable of being held in remission with some kind of humanitarian vaccine? Well, I think you've already talked about those vaccines before, but I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more. I think that's a nice way of talking about the counterbalance to Civic Virus.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, the words that she talked about Civic Virus, she talked about remission, something being alleviated in some way. And she didn't just say a vaccine, she said like a human vaccine, humanitarian, if I remember correctly, humanitarian vaccine. And so there are clear structural challenges in our politics and public life. So I don't want to offer a false solution that says, if only more people got engaged, we could fully vaccine ourselves and inoculate ourselves against this civic virus, because as we've talked about tonight, it's going to require political leaders to step forward in different ways. It's going to require, we haven't talked about the news media too much, but it's going to require a different kind of news media to take place. It's going to require various organizations, institutions to change the ways in which they do public business. But here's the thing. These different things I just mentioned are made up of human beings. And so it's not the full answer, but a starting point is that if we inoculate ourselves with these vaccines, more of us will step into these positions, more of us will demand a different kind of behavior, more of us will create a different kind of political mandate, more of us will demonstrate that we expect different kinds of conduct because we're doing it ourselves. And I happen to believe America, that as stained and as troubling as parts of our American history are, and they really are, we have continually moved toward a more perfect union over our time as a nation. And I believe our task is to keep moving in that direction. That requires people to step up and engage with one another.
Well, you mentioned local media, and we have one of our attendees tonight, the former publisher of our local newspaper, the Ripon Commonwealth Press, Tim Light. And Tim still writes a column every week in the newspaper. And here is his question. Why is your first antidote to fight the civic virus to start locally? Our community of Ripon is in a rural area and quite conservative. that hosts a liberal arts college, which tends to be quite liberal. We face an ideological chasm that seems wider than ever since 2016. Right now, we have a mayoral and county supervisor races in which candidates seem to be talking past each other with little or no common ground on which they can agree or rally a consensus.
Yeah.
How do you react? That gives you a little flavor of what Tim thinks about our local fight rather than flight right now.
Yeah, well, look, Tim, what you've just described is what I hear every day. So I believe you. I'm not going to question what you just observed or articulated. What I would say is that those individuals who are running for political office have adopted and embraced practices that once were largely reserved for our national leaders, then filtered into our state legislatures, and now increasingly has infected us like a civic virus in our local communities, even small communities like your own. And I find that across the country. I don't think, and I said this the other day to some folks who were in our public innovator lab, we had about 60 folks learning our approach in a public innovators lab, and someone said something similar to what you just asked him. Excuse me, I said, you know, I hope to God that those elected leaders in your community change. I hope they somehow wake up, but I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. I think where we have to start is like the folks in Reading, Pennsylvania that I spoke about earlier, who came together and created a shared agenda for their community that they can begin to act on now with other leaders who want to do business differently. And here's the thing. When they started down this path, the mayor showed up. Why? Because he had to. Because people were starting to work differently. When we worked in Clark County, Kentucky, when the mayor turned his back on me and wouldn't talk to me, ultimately, 2 years later, when his community started to take action differently, he showed up at a political candidate forum that was run by local citizens who said, you're going to have to answer our questions, not the typical questions you get asked every day. In Flint, Michigan, where I was working, the mayor wouldn't engage with folks. He was corrupt. He was on the take. And eventually he got recalled because enough people got together and decided to do business differently. So I think the answer to this is don't hold your breath for the local races you just described to change. It's not going to happen soon. Let's get together. Let's find those who are ready to roll. Let's find those who are willing to do work differently, including leaders, including faith leaders, including folks at the college, including residents. And let's get to work and let's get these leaders to have to show up, because without showing up, they're going to get left behind.
That leads to a question about young people, Rich. Perhaps they are our future, and maybe that's where a lot of hope lies. And this question comes from Laura DeGolier, who is a businesswoman in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is just to the east of Ripon. And she says, your answers are right on. However, youth are no longer taught civics in school. Yeah. They don't understand how government works or why they should be involved. How do we solve that?
I knew there was a but coming there. So yes, I am concerned like you are that we don't teach civics. I've been involved in a lot of meetings recently about that. But here's the good news. In a lot of the communities where we've been working, where we engage young people, youth, people still in middle school and high school and beyond, but largely middle school and high school, what they do say is this. They say, I want my voice to be heard. They say, I want to solve problems like mental health because too many of us young people are facing mental health challenges in our lives. I want to figure out what we can do after school because I'm bored and I'm getting into trouble. I want to figure out how we can deal with the opioid and meth problem because honestly, my parents are spending more time looking for their next fix than they are fixing me dinner. And that's a quote. That's not me making that up. And so all of these things that they're talking about are related to civic action because they require shared or collective action to take to make any real progress on. And so here's what I would say. They may not know the three branches of government, maybe as well as one would hope. They may not know who their elected officials are. I don't know, but let's suppose they don't. What they do have, though, are innate instincts to come together and work together on common things. And that's where I think we need to begin, or at least tap into, to engage them in things that are meaningful and relevant and significant in their lives. And then maybe they will want to learn these other things as well. After all, that's, as you probably know, that's the basis of project-based learning in a lot of schools, which is let's find things that are more relevant. Let's use those as a doorway into learning, and then let's expand the learning opportunities when we walk through that doorway together.
Benjamin Anderson tonight, our attendees, has a follow-up question that regards education. He says, you say, Rich, in the summary of the report, and he's quoting, while each of these communities is very different in terms of its demographics, economics, and history, they created similar agendas for education that focus on such areas as mental health support for young people, after-school activities, teachers who look more like the community, and addressing inequities across schools, among others. End of quote from the report. What does teachers who look more like the community mean in this context?
Yeah, so what this person's, is it Benjamin?
Yes, Benjamin.
Yeah, what Benjamin's referring to is not the Civic Virus report, but a piece I wrote about these, or part of a piece I wrote about Civic Virus, but about these education initiatives we're doing in Lexington, Clarksville, and Reading, Pennsylvania. What people are referring to there, Brian, is that in places like Reading, Pennsylvania, or Lexington, where you have large segments of the population of kids who are African-American, who are Latino, who are of other ethnicities, that they are by and large being taught by white teachers, and that people aren't saying that white teachers in these cases aren't effective, but what people are saying is, boy, it sure would be helpful if we had more folks who looked like me, who understood more intuitively and instinctively my lived experience, who understood more instinctively sort of cultural competencies, who provides, and this is something that young people have said to us, who provide more of a role model, that I see people up in front of the classroom teaching, or I see an administrator who looks like me, who inspires me that I can be like them. And so I think all those things are really critically important.
This question comes from a high school classmate of mine.
Now, can I just say real quickly, Brian?
Sure.
I probably shouldn't say this, but this is the perfect example that some people could use to demagogue and to polarize a community. Right. By saying, this is anti-white, this is, discriminating against white teachers, on and on it goes. And if you really understood what people are saying, you would know that that's a false kind of polarization. That's demagoguery.
It's manipulation for political purposes.
Yeah.
One of my classmates from high school, Barry Ryan, who lives in near Bridgeport, Connecticut, is attending tonight. And this is what he asks you. He says, Rich, I am a member of Braver Angels. It is a national organization that brings people from different sides of the political aisle, reds and blues, together to foster dialogue with each other, emphasizing improved listening skills. Do you collaborate with Braver Angels?
We haven't. I know a lot about their work. I deeply admire their work. We run in similar circles of groups. And look, I hope there comes a time when we are directly collaborating together in communities. That would be a great thing, because I love their work. So
great. I have one final question. We've run through the questions in the Q&A. You say in the report that more leaders and news media persons need to stop filling people with misinformation and fears, and that the detrimental effects of social media in dividing people must be mitigated. But what I'd like to ask you is, how can we achieve this and still protect freedom of speech for everybody?
You know, look, is freedom of speech by the news media better reflecting the wholeness of the issues that we face as opposed to just one side? Is that an abridgment of freedom of speech? Is freedom of speech a political leader saying, here's how I understand the challenges that we face, let's say in the mental health crisis in some communities, and reflecting that and still taking a position based on their beliefs or how they see the world? Is that an abridgment of freedom of speech? Is freedom of speech going to a school board meeting, and when you get up to speak and someone shouts you down and someone says, we have a ground rule here that says when someone's speaking, freedom of speech also includes listening? Is that an abridgment of freedom of speech or a protection of freedom of speech? So I don't buy that the minute we start saying we can do better, that someone pulls out the First Amendment as a weapon to close down conversation and freedom of speech so that they can pursue their own political agenda at the expense of our common good. I can't buy into that. I think we need to push back on that. We need to be brave. Someone talked about braver angels. We need to elicit and tap into our braver angels to push back on that and say, no, there's a broader definition of freedom of speech, and we ought to at least be able to talk about that definition and see how we can move forward together.
Okay. Laura DeGolia has another question tonight. She says, would some of our problems with the media be solved if we put the equal time rule back into the place for the media?
It certainly would help. It certainly would help. I mean, I'm not a media. I have worked a lot with the news media. The Institute has transformed major newsrooms. We've worked with public broadcasting, but I am not sort of a media policy expert. But I can't imagine that equal time wouldn't help in some ways.
Yeah, and would you feel that if your work is showing that people at the local level can come together, can create a vaccine against misinformation and fear, do you think it's from the local level of people as consumers in the media demanding better coverage and less polarization and so forth, rather than government regulation?
Well, I don't know if it has to be either or, but what I do believe is that if people, just to play on what you said, Brian, if more people came together as citizens or members of their community, as opposed to consumers of public life and claimants within public life and complainers about public life and dividers in public life, I suspect that they would be better, I don't want to say consumers, they would be better engagers with media and look for different sources of media to help augment their view of what's going on in their lives and in society.
They'd be better prepared to discern, what is the grain of truth in this and what is just false information, if they had greater confidence in themselves, in their local communities, of sharing ideas across lines.
And a greater, absolutely, well said, and a greater desire. I mean, part of this is, how do we tap into people's latent desire to be part of something larger than themselves? That's just, I mean, you know this better than I do, given your background. It's part of who we are. It's part of being human being. It's part of our makeup.
Well, since this is a liberal arts college, Howard Rigdon, who is attending tonight, has some remarks about the liberal arts. He says, this is what the definition of a liberal arts education is. A liberal arts degree is generally meant to prepare students for a variety of career paths versus a specific career. In addition, liberal arts colleges tend to give students more freedom with their studies. Students can sometimes create their own programs that meet their individual interests. Here at Ripon College, we have self-designed majors that are interdisciplinary, that students themselves put together with faculty from different departments for their senior project. So do you want to talk a little bit about, I mean, you've had a liberal arts education yourself.
Yes. I'm a product of a liberal arts college. And, you know, when someone asked earlier, I think it may have been the person who worked at the State Department before, who
Catherine
talked about
Schultz,
whether or not things are worse than they were before. And I reeled off a whole bunch of things that have exacerbated the situation. Let me add another one, which goes to Howard's question. As many folks know, over the last 100, 150 years, we've had the rise of professionalization and specialization, which I believe has further fragmented our society. And while it's brought a lot of benefits to society, I think it's brought some ill effects as well, which is we've become so specialized that we don't see across things. We don't have a humanistic perspective on a lot of things at times. And so whether or not people go to a liberal arts college or not, both my children did, but whether or not people do, we know the percentages are pretty low. I think Howard's question has a lot of implications for how we educate in general, no matter where someone goes to middle school, high school, or if they go to post-secondary, whatever they do after. I think it has a lot to do with how we prepare professionals and how we prepare other individuals in society to make their way through society. And I think it's something we really need to recommit ourselves to if we want a society where people want to become part of something larger than themselves and believe that there's a place for them to do so.
Good. Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation, Rich, but I'd like to ask you, what would you want to leave with our virtual attendees tonight? What would you hope we take away from this conversation to reduce social isolation and flight or fight tendencies in our local civic lives with each other?
Yeah, I would say, I think one very quick thing, it may be the only quick thing I said today. I would say that we have a fundamental choice. We can choose to surrender to this false notion of polarization and feel the ill effects of that for years to come. Or we can choose to step forward and become part of rebuilding our lives, our communities, and this nation. I believe that we each have the power to make that choice, and I believe we each have a sphere of influence to act on that choice. And that no matter how big your action is, or importantly, how small your action is, and many of us will just take small actions, every action is worthy. You talked about my faith before. In my faith, there's a teaching that says if you save one life, you save the world. And obviously, if you save one life, you don't save the world, but you have become part of saving the world. You have made your contribution in saving the world. You have exercised your sense of agency in saving the world. You have demonstrated to others that they should step forward and help save the world. And that's where we are today. We each need to step forward.
I think Rabbi Harwood would be very pleased with your final sermon. You've left us with a lot to think about, Richard. We really want to thank you. And so on behalf of the Department of Psychology at the college and the Center for Politics and the People, and all here tonight, all the attendees who listened to your words of wisdom, we want to thank you for sharing with us a very important message on what's happening in our civil culture. And you've also given us hope and guidelines on what we can do in face-to-face encounters in our local communities among diverse groups to solve our problems. So we really want to thank you, and thank you for the work you're doing all over the country. It is absolutely essential that your vaccine inoculate enough of us so that we don't fall prey to the polarization spin doctors, because they will not have the last word if we are strong citizens. So we want to thank you so very much. And we want to hope that you'll come and visit Ripon. I purposely chose the background of the spring campus look. It's not quite that way today, but maybe we could have you in later in the spring or next fall when the weather is a little more conducive for being outside. I'd like to thank all the attendees for attending, and I'd like to make just a couple of brief announcements about upcoming events. On April 12th, 2 weeks from this afternoon, the Center for Politics and the People will be hosting another Zoom webinar. It will be a conversation with Professor Jennifer Kobina, who is Associate Professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. She will discuss her book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot: Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. Based on interviews with close to 200 protesters in Ferguson and Baltimore after the killing of unarmed Black men by police, Professor Kobina examines how protesters perceived their relations with police and the state of their communities. She explains how these and other experiences galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement, which supports greater investments in minority communities for education, employment, and social services as effective ways to reduce crime, protect public safety, and improve police-community relations. And during the last week in April, we have a student advisory board on the center, and the students will take the lead to host with the Center for Diversity and Inclusion on the campus a event focused on the immigration situation today and citizenship. More information about this event will be forthcoming soon. So we thank you all this afternoon for attending this webinar, and good evening. And we will send the recording to those of you who would like to follow up viewing this, and also with the information on how to link into more of the projects that the Harwood Center for Public Innovation is promoting. So again, thank you all for attending, and especially thank you, Rich. This has been really a very, very rich conversation.
Thanks so much.
Sorry for the pun, but it's been very rich. Thank you so much. Peace.